In a tyranny, you cannot have opposition. It's an oxymoron.
What he does, he wants to get the power, and he wants to be Putin 2.0.
Мы не можем не победить.
We have to defend ourselves in a serious way, not by simply waiting for Russia to get better or waiting for Navalny or Yulia Navalny to ride in on the white horse into the Kremlin and build democracy. That's not going to happen. The difficulty for us in Europe or US is to not come down to the Russian level. We cannot fight Russian lies with more lies. We have to fight them with truth.
Hello, I'm Jenny Klochko. You're watching my podcast, the platform for guest stories beyond your daily newsfeed. And today I would like us to talk about Russian opposition, or so-called Russian opposition. And if you ask me why, there's so many stories about Ukraine. There's so many stories. Donald Trump on daily basis just giving us topic after topic, fact after fact, and a lot of work for me as a journalist and many of my colleagues. Well, I tell you why, because as for the audience from the different countries in the West, from different continents, and one of you might think why Ukrainians and the Russian opposition don't get together, because it feels like they all fight in Putin, they all fight in Putin regime. But you probably noticed it's not so easy, and there are lots of flags alarming for Ukrainian side, and Ukrainians at least keeping silent or distance themselves. And I would like us to discuss why these things concern me, why this is worrying, and why you should be aware. Because there are a lot of things slipping through the minds of the Western people, and they all sort of going from the Kremlin, they all Kremlin narratives, and I can't allow them. I don't want we to have it in our sort of English language media space. So let's identify it, let's have discussion, and let's hear what you think at the end, and leave your comments in the at the end. So my guest today, Andrew Chakhoyan, is academic director of a course of multilateralism, globalization, corporate diplomacy at the Graduate School of Social Sciences, University of Amsterdam. If you think that's all, no. He is a former US government official at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. He has written extensively on Ukraine, Russia, and international security. His columns appeared in Politico, Newsweek, The Hill, The Kiev Independent, and other outlets. A Ukrainian American, he studied at Harvard, Kennedy School, and Donetsk State Technical University. So you have an idea. This person, he knows what he's talking about, and also he has the perspective from Ukraine, perspective from America. Now he's based in Amsterdam, so it's European approach. Let's see how exciting and interesting it's going to be. Andrew, hi. Thank you for finding time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Jenny. Super happy to be here.
So, we can agree on the facts with you that Putin is an evil. But my question is it Putin's war, Andrew? And what's wrong with this statement? Could you explain us?
Putin's war is one of the worst misconceptions, and the paradox of it is there's supply and demand for it. You know, the demand is coming from us, and I think you explained it in the intro. Is we wish for this big problem to be explainable. Is this one evil person, and if only that one evil person wasn't there, things would be better. And that's the demand side. We wish for it to be this way because this way would be much easier, would be much the world wouldn't be as a scary place that it is. But we know it not to be true because in 1930s there was no Putin around, and Russia attempted genocide. It's this war of Russia trying to colonize Ukraine, recolonize Ukraine, absorb Ukraine. It's a centuries long. It's as I say, it's from czars to commissars to kleptocrats. It doesn't matter who's in charge. Who sits in the Kremlin is irrelevant. The the wheels of Russian imperial ethos of that place that's centered on Moscow. The wheels of history are pushing it towards invasion, towards aggression, and attributing it to Putin is wrong. But also not attributing to Putin is incomplete, right? It's like he did issue the order, and there are two parallel narratives are both true. One idea is the reason Ukraine poses a threat to Putin's regime is because if there was an independent and democratic Ukraine, then that would set an example for Russia, and then tyrannical regime in Moscow would struggle to exist. This is true, and this is in parallel to the other one, that Russia as an idea is an empire. There's no country Russia. There's no nation. Russian nation does not exist. But there is imperial all through and through entity that stretches, from Pacific Ocean all the way to the border with Poland and so on. But this entire plot of land is an empire, and people that live there are imperially minded, and all of this is then manifests itself in the aggression that every Russian leader always exhibits. One last thing I'll say before I hand it back. I was reading Victor Rad's article, maybe from 2019, and he says Russians themselves decided to look at their history for a couple of centuries, and they counted, I think, 32 wars, and only two of them were defensive. Basically, it's this thing that we call Russia, which I like to call Moscow-centered terror enterprise, is always attacks, always invades, and it has little to do with Putin and everything to do with Putin, but it definitely is not Putin's war.
But you would think that people who would suffer from persecution, from the prison, we know sort of like those the leftovers of Russian opposition who survived so far, they should have been healthier from this imperialism. They should understand this sort of like the enemy within. They should be having this educational dialogue with own people and saying, look, here is we got wrong. We were carried away. Why do we sort of try to keep people who don't want to be with us? Why do sort of you need to be brave enough to look in the mirror and actually own the bad things you have, and you like it or not, it's there. But it's kind of like, like with alcoholics, the first step to recovery, to say and recognize that you're alcoholic. But do we see there's ownership and recognition with people who represent the Russian opposition? So let's go through. It's Ilya Yashin, recently freed out of prison, the widow of Alexei Navalny, Yulia Navalnaya, Vladimir Karamurza. I mean, I don't know, should we mention the Khodorkovsky, who has spent 10 years in prison and now he's based in London, and he sort of like very much media present. He was at the Donald Trump inauguration, so he quite sort of influential figure. But do we see, why do you think we don't see this ownership and recognition, this evil within themselves, and not having this honest conversation with their own people?
Yeah, I have two takes at this, and one is the national idea or the absence of it, and the other one is the gift of defeat. How did German people find out their history? How did they figure out that Hitler was a terrible, evil person? If Germany won the war, it would have been right in the history, and the German people would have not known the crimes they have committed, because not knowing is much easier. The gift of defeat is what Germany needed, what Japan needed to learn, to study, to understand, to atone. I think that word matters a lot. Russian people are now rehabilitating Stalin. It's Stalin caused as much death and destruction to people populating that land from Moscow to Vladivostok, just as much as Hitler, if not worse. But they want to think of him as hero. Why is that? It's because they were spared the gift of defeat, and they cannot learn their history. If you walk down the street in Moscow or any other town and you say, when did the World War start? World War II, when did it start? Everyone will say in 41. And you say, no, it started in 39 when Hitler and Stalin signed a secret pact, and that's the beginning of war because two evils coexisted, co-conspired to divide an independent state, both driven by imperial ambitions. Two countries, the Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, coming together to prosecute their ambitions starting World War II. Russian people don't know it, will never know it, they don't want to know it. And they will not learn it. They will not atone for the crimes of Stalin regime for Holodomor, the famine in the 30s. They don't want to admit that that was done deliberately because they've not gotten the gift of defeat. Now, the question of identity is another one. If if you if you know yourself to be Ukrainian, you know what it means to you, right? It's there's the Ukrainian credo, the word voля, right, is freedom, will to freedom. Like there's an essence to being a Ukrainian person, and then and this idea of defending the country, living in freedom. There's a lot coming with it. Uh, and what is it to be Russian? If Russia as a nation doesn't exist, it only exists as an empire. The only Russian person would be an imperial minded person. So that's the paradox is I've written a few times that a unitary Russian state or Russian Federation or Russian Empire doesn't matter. This plot of land that stretches this far with internal colonies in Ichkeria or Chechnya or Dagestan or Sakha or whatever the lands that are colonized by Moscow, although those lands are homes to nations that Russia erased or Moscow erased, right? And so if anyone who lives in that space and accepts reality as it is, they cannot not be an imperialist. As soon as they stop being imperialist, they stop being a Russian person. So it's a very, it's a philosophical and complex thought, but the reason the Russian opposition cannot carry this flag and say, I'm going to fight for Russia, they can fight Putin, but if they believe in the unitary preservation of that monstrosity, they by default are imperialist. So they cannot be a serious opposition. And last point I'd make is the word opposition. What does that mean? It's a feature within democracy. Within democracy, you can have a party that holds power and there's an opposition. In a tyranny, you cannot have opposition. It's an oxymoron. There is no such thing as Russian opposition. But they're definitely anti-Putin. And I also absolutely admire the personal, willingness to sacrifice and Karamurza went back and went to prison and risked his life. And this is all true. And it's just like with Russian imperial mindset and Putin, the evil dictator, those two things could be true at the same time. Person could, in fact, be courageous, but show up with ideas that are unhelpful. When I, I don't want to criticize anyone individually. In a sense, Russian people who don't want Putin in power are in some sense allies for Ukraine. But are they genuine opposition? Are they offering a future forward-looking vision for Russia? I've not I've not come across them.
You wrote a beautiful piece for Kiev Post. You sent me the link, I read it, and that's quite precise because, in general, I get what you say, and I have zillion examples on that, sort of here and there, and I experienced it because anybody who used to be part of the Soviet Union came across Russians, they would feel their chauvinism and all other those things. And, for example, I'm afraid we can't avoid sort of mentioning the names or giving the quotes to the viewers because general concept is very difficult to digest if you don't have exact example. For what I mean, um, late Alexei Navalny, he was killed in prison by Putin and his people. So you would think he's fighting corruption, he was just like opening the truth, he is doing investigations, all those things present is very, should have been inspiring. But the truth is, it's my view, I have to warn. So the truth is, he did all those things to change Putin. But the question, if he would be different as Putin, I doubt so. Because when it comes to Ukrainian question, when it comes to Crimea question, and we all know his answer when he said, well, Crimea is not a sandwich to return, is it? So for me, it's a flag of imperialism. For me, it's no, it's a big no. With that answer, he finished as an opposition, because what he does, he wants to get the power and he wants to be Putin 2.0, which doesn't really work for Ukraine, does it? Or, for example, his wife, Yulia, after his death, when she was doing an interview, and what she was saying, because you mentioned her, didn't you, in your article? And why here sort of could you talk it through and explain why we see it as an indication of imperialism?
It's, I think there is an instinct in Russian opposition to separate the people from the evil regime. But we know that Russian people are comfortable with this violence. When we look at opposition, I want to judge them on their actions. If somebody stands up on stage and says, "Let's remove sanctions," or they do not understand that Ukraine must win. If those things are not obvious to them, if removal of sanctions will not make things better, it'll make things worse because and their argument is, oh, we're punishing Russian people, but Russian people are not they don't live on the moon. It's their government. Whether they support Putin or don't support Putin, they have to take responsibility for their government. It's nobody else's government. You know, I live in the Netherlands. Netherlands did not install Putin to run Russia. It was an Americans who delivered this awful dictator to punish Russian people. It's Russian people who must own their government. And uh, um, and and so when we go to Navalny, and so let's give him benefit of the doubt. He wanted to do good things for Russia. He wanted democracy. Let's imagine all this to be true. And then he gets to power and he pushes that agenda forward. He says, let's be democratic. If Russia slowly but surely, under some enlightened leadership, move towards democracy, I cannot possibly imagine it staying a unitary state because you will have to devolve power. And then as soon as you give uh, power to local authorities, then you give them a chance to rediscover their nationhood. Tatarstan will find that they're a Tatar nation and they're not Russian people because why are they even speaking this language? It's because they were colonized by Moscovia. And so I don't know Russian geography all that well. I did visit a number of Russian cities. I've seen Russian people and this chauvinism is a good word, but they're all endowed with this identity of trying to live with this violence that was enacted upon all of them, and they live in this humiliation and violence, this endless cycle where humiliation and violence is dished out by the Kremlin, and the people living in that Frankenstein state have to then wake up accepting or getting showered with this humiliation and violence and go on with their day. And so the way they cope is by inflicting the same humiliation and violence onto others. And it's a very sick society. And I I always hold myself back from using the word citizen when it comes to people living in Russia because citizenship is rights and responsibilities. If they were Russian citizens, they would take some responsibility, but instead they're all claiming victimhood. Yulia Navalny is a victim of Putin. Well, then, if everyone's a victim of Putin, who is pushing all the buttons? Who are those 500,000 Russian soldiers, most of whom have volunteered in exchange for cash to go and kill? And so we need that reality acknowledged, and the Russian so-called opposition fails to acknowledge it.
Do you know, I think they have to come up with something else, a bunch of victimization of own soldiers, they called our boys, and saying that they sort of like, as you said, victims of the regime, of this and that. But the truth is, we have interceptions released by SBU, DIU, and we hear how they excited for sort of like getting killed, getting paid, committing war crimes. I'm not going to quote like what kind of violence, but we're fully aware it's already widespread. But also, there's one thing I think they have to come up with a new, because even recently, Financial Times, there was investigation, and they discovered there's actually committed genocide on Ukrainian soldiers has systematic character, and they identify one of those guys who did it, who filmed himself. And so it's, even if you're blind, you will be able to see these things. And in order for them to create the new narrative to exist, I mean, it's the only way for them to go. And the moment you mentioned is about Moscovia and the fact of disintegration of Russia. We sort of, in Ukraine, everyone knows this map in the office of Kirill Budanov, the head of DIU, sort of like dismantled, and it could have been sort of left on the side, right? And considering as one of the tools, Ukrainian propaganda to lift up of the fighting spirit, and that's it. But when you listen to Yulia Navalny interviews where she was saying, "Oh, we all people of the common ground," but how the people of the common ground can nickname each other Hachiki or this or that, and it's very offensive word. It's the same as the people of sort of the Black Americans to call Negroes or things like that, and they still, it's active part of the everyday culture of communication, and it's normal for them. You see, it's just like I explained like a million times. There's, even if the Soviet Union, the sort of like golden age or golden period, there was never equality between all the nations. There was always like some sort of like equal and some a little bit higher. And guess who was higher? For example, such fact, painful fact. Look all over the world, and there's the graves of the Soviet soldiers, right? And everyone sees it as the Russian soldiers. But are they Russian? Are they actually ethnical Russian? Are those Ukrainians? Are those Georgians? Or are those Armenians? Or maybe they from other republics? So, and the world learns the history and say, look at the glorious Russian people. They were so brave. They were fighting for us, giving us the freedom against the Nazi regime. So how unfairness, even now, is this like this historical heritage, and it's of course appalling. Of course, it's unacceptable. Do you see any shift now? You're based in Amsterdam. This perception and identification that Russians doesn't mean sort of Russian themselves. The Russians from the past, it means Soviets, and it can be any people of any ethnical group.
Yeah, it's I think we talked about this complicated idea that the history is written by the victors, and so the narrative of Ukraine or Soviet Union was owned by Russia, and the Western academia had a Moscow-centric view of that place. And the fact that Ukraine has resisted aggression since 2014 is demanding. It's this the courage of the nation is the demand to be recognized, and it's people with hearts and brains hopefully feel shame for if their job was to understand Russia and Ukraine, they hopefully understand that they were mistaken, and they're reviewing how they thought about things, and hopefully they're paying attention to Timothy Snyder or Sergei Plakhy, looking at history through a different lens, because Russia claims all kinds of things that are not grounded in reality. Why do we even call Moscovia Russia? It's because one of their kings, just picked up a crown and said, "Now I'm a ruler of all Rus." Uh,
Richard the First.
yeah, and so made this wild claim, and Europeans kept referring to that place as Moscovia for a century, and everyone knew it was Moscovia, but the king or the czar would say, "No, I'm a ruler of all Rus," and that just call me that. And because they were lucky, Moscovia was a tax collector for the Mongols in its time, and the strange, not strange or not even ironic, but almost providential thing for what Russia is today is that the tyranny won over democracy. Because at the time, way back in the days, you had medieval civilization around Kiev, and there were new city-states being born. Novgorod was one, Moscovia or Moscow was another. Novgorod was modeled on the Ukrainian model or on the Kiev model. It was democratic. It had the same idea of laws and a voice of the community mattered, and Moscow was modeled onto uh, uh, execute tax collection orders for the Khan. So it was this model of violence, and then so it defeats Novgorod, and the Moscovia kingdom starts when tyranny defeats democracy. Since then, in Europe, there is an imperial legacy, right? So it's interesting that by abandoning imperial legacy over time, we can now recognize Russia for what it is. But it takes, like, French Empire, it collapsed when France lost Algerian War, and that's just a few decades ago. It's not that long ago. And then so in a sense, empires would empathize with empires. And so if London was ruling over half the world, well, then Moscow was ruling over some of its lands that captured, and kind of made sense. Well, let's recognize each other as peers and so on. And all of this has not been yet worked through, and it has to. And Russia cannot become a post-imperial state until it loses all of its colonies. And when we look at Russia, let us not mistake it for a country. It's Moscow in the center. It sucks all the blood from all the regions. And if you think of that model of that entire state, it's this how does empire work, right? There's a center that kind of milks everything from everywhere and oppresses the colonies. Well, that's the Russian model. All the wealth is in Siberia, but all the wealthy people are in Moscow. So you have the most billionaires per capita until recent times were all there, and it's almost like this paradox, right? As long as Moscow has access to Siberian natural wealth, it will be doing what it's doing, is demonstrating violence, pushing everybody down, Russian citizens, invading neighbors. It has to do it because it needs to maintain that system, the system of extractive colonial rule. Um, but I don't know if I want to dwell on this. I think what we don't want to fall into a trap of being a eugenicists ourselves. Like, there's nothing genetically wrong with anybody. Like, Russian people are stuck in this system that they themselves created, and they're you know in this particular sense, they might as well be victims of their imperial setup. They are stuck in circles. They will keep going, and oppression, humiliation, conquest, all of this will never end until they lose a big war, until they see themselves in the mirror and say, we have done it. We Russian people have done this to Ukraine. We have done this to, folks in Kamchatka. Like we've erased their culture. We killed everybody who wanted to fight for nationhood or who wanted to carry the national idea forward. We've done it. We, Russian people, are responsible for what we've done, and we must atone. And that process cannot happen until they lose the war. Up until then, they're stuck. And you say, okay, Russian people are this way. It's nothing genetically wrong with anyone. They're every person, born the person, but they go into this culture, and this culture of genocide is not it's like we cannot separate Russian culture from the Russian violence. Those things are two sides of the same coin.
Well, you see, for me as an outside, it's curious thing that how come the Siberia is okay to live under control of Moscow bloodsuckers? It seems absolutely comfortable, and the biggest bloodsuckers in the Kremlin, and everyone. This is what's shocking for me, and everyone, they are supporting him. And what's I was shocked, it was before the full-scale invasion. There was 2021. And I was the producer on the podcast with the John Sweeney's known British journalist. And we did the of the podcast about the Putin's poisoning. And one of the victims, the early victims of this pattern of his behavior, how he was destroying his enemies or the people he wanted to get rid of, was journalist Yuri Shekachyhin. And I was in touch with his widow, and it was we had very good connection, and we had these long conversations. And one, I think probably our last conversation was she was saying, oh, these sanctions are so unfair for us, for people. And she was somehow involved in the film production. She's like, we had planned filming somewhere in Europe, I don't remember, and now we can't because there's sanctions. It's not us, it's Putin. I say, yes, but Putin killed your husband. You shouldn't be, having this rhetorics. You should be different, have conversation. You should do something about it. You can't accept someone is killing your husband and you are just like, wow, I want just to live my happy clappy life. It just please lift up the sanctions that we can go and have fun filming elsewhere. This was shocking and I can't understand it. But how do you find the statement of the Russian so-called opposition representative Ilya Yashin? And the disintegration of Russia would be a catastrophe, not only for the country and people, but a tragedy for the world. Where's this tragedy for the world coming? I think world is doing absolutely fine. Why? Where? And does it remind you something? And if does, what is it?
Well, it's what's Putin's famous phrase is the collapse of Soviet Union was the worst tragedy, not Holocaust, the worst tragedy, not the gulags with millions of Russians killed by other Russians under leadership of a Russian tyrant who happened to have Georgian ethnic roots. But it's how is people gaining freedom not a good thing? How when Soviet Union collapsed, everybody had a chance at freedom. Ukraine wants to defend it, and Russian people flirted with democracy for a year or two, and then did not last, and they reverted straight back to tyranny. Um, but then, yeah, I think it's right back to where we started. Is being as long as a person says I'm a Russian person, that's their identity. They're the vehicle of Russian culture, and anytime you use the word Russian, you have to add imperialist because you cannot be Russian otherwise. You cannot be anti-imperialist Russian because then you cease being a Russian person at that very time. I know it's a paradox, but he's right to say it because he wants to be a Russian leader. Therefore, he needs to preserve the empire, and the essence of Russia is the colonial rule from Moscow down. And as Volodymyr Yermolenko put it really well, is different empires had different models of oppression. You have kind of when in the West people think of empires, there is a strong racial element, right? Is white people oppressing people of color, whereas in Russia's way of conquest and colonization, it wasn't, and I'm reciting what Volodymyr Yermolenko says, but his ideas is erasure. Is a Muscovite will show up in Siberia and say, "You are like me. You are also Russian. So abandon your culture, pretend that you're like me, and then start speaking Russian, start being Russian, and you'll be fine." But in that offer is the offer to surrender freedom, surrender identity, become this drone of reporting to the Kremlin, just looking up at the Tsar and expecting command. And that's the essence again of Russian culture is subordination, the power vertical, right? Is everybody's looking up and the Tsar is looking down. There is no horizontal organization, which is for Ukraine, the only organization is horizontal. As soon as you try to establish power vertical, the society rebels, saying we don't want to be oppressed by some center, because that was always somebody else's power vertical, not a local Ukrainian, which is again a horizontal way of organizing society.
I have a feeling, looking at the representatives of so-called opposition, and I have a feeling it's where, with it's important when your desire goes sort of like resonate together with people's support. And the people we see now, they actually, there is no such connection. For example, Boris Nemtsov, late Boris Nemtsov, he could have been, the representative of Russian opposition, and you could see you like him or not. You could see his charisma, you could see people's support, and you could see after he was killed near the Kremlin walls, people came and they were supporting and all of them. It hasn't, when, for example, the early stages of Navalny, when he was arrested, people didn't come to the prison. People didn't come to support. People didn't come to release our leader. He was just living their happy, clappy life. Nobody cared. And the same with Yashin, who Karamurza and the other. They want to be in a position, but they don't have the people's support. And even, this Spartan going to prison, avoidable prison. Look, Yashin, he was released and he was saying, "Oh, why didn't you release me? I don't want to be released. I want to go back to prison." And he was saying about this absolutely diabolical romantic stories about good people in prison. And good people, I don't mean people in the cells, people, the guards, the sort of like the managers of the prison. He was saying how lovely they were communicating and all of that. And you probably wouldn't agree, or I don't know, but it reminded me at my sort of, in my teens, I was a big lover of Dostoevsky. It was a phase. I went through this. And it reminded his quote where he was he was quoting, he was saying, sorry, he was saying that the human, something like that. I can be wrong, but I'll try to be as close to the meaning. So the human wasn't born for happiness. Happiness should be just sort of like deserved through the sufferings, and only sufferings making us something better. And I have a feeling, so if you, as a possible candidate for the Russian opposition, you want to be the opposition, and kind of you need to go be sort of christened or baptized by the prison to be kind of like qualified as a real opposition. But still, nobody cares. You don't have support, and doesn't matter how much you start to normalize, Ukrainian losses or the evidence of the war crimes committed and systematic war crimes committed. It's like children, civilians, even soldiers when been captured. Still, you don't resonate with own people. Where's the courage to recognize it? What do you think of it?
I think one topic to explore, which I'm not the expert on it, but the role of the uh, Orthodox Christianity and kind of deference to power, because in Catholicism you also have the suffering and the hell and the rest of it, but I think Orthodox Christianity, as if especially under Soviet or latest regime. It's an instrument of a state power, and it's about this messianic mission. Like it's Russia wants to justify itself to itself. I think that's very it's it's a hard concept for outsiders to grasp. Is if you were a French person living in I don't know Bordeaux, France, and you just know you're French. You don't need French state justifying French state to French people because everyone's comfortable living in that place. But because Russia is this oppression machine, is the I call it Frankenstein state because it's made out of parts that don't belong together, and it needs to justify itself to itself. But in that, it needs to justify Moscow as a central authority where everybody defers to power, and then what can it give in return? Is this messianic idea, or we're great, we're destined, or we need to conquer whatever? It's the great Russia is an important story, and I think that gets to your question in some way is um, why go back and go to prison and so on? Because this belief, this superstition is so prevalent in Russia. It's like people believe all kinds of strange things, but because they have so little control over their own destiny, right? If you have sense of freedom, then you also gain sense of agency. If you take responsibility for your actions, you have way of determining where you go, right? But if you surrender all of it, if the state always takes all of it away from you, then people end up with kind of way of seeing the world through the lens of superstition or this higher mission or to be great or you know Russia is raising from its knees, like all these stories that are put in place of a coherent, forward-looking narrative saying we're going to build something together. It's going to be better than what we now have, because that then is hard to create more prosperous society, more fair societies. It's very, very difficult. And again, my absolutely firm belief that if Russia was to move on that journey of betterment, you cannot do it as this vast land. This account on Twitter, Darth Putin
Yes,
says
I love it.
he
Made
was,
me laugh again and again.
yeah, but he refers to himself as Putin. Says, well, that's how we became the biggest country on this planet by benevolently and anti-imperialistically conquering everyone all the way. It's like how could we not see it that no normal country can stretch this far? And if you look at you know the supposed Russians in the Far East, they have so little to do with the Russians in Moscovia. But yet we in the West we think, oh, it's just one country. Oh, it happened to be this big. It's not one country. It's a colonial system with all the regions are nations that have been erased or in the process of being erased. Chechnya said, no, we don't want to be that. We want to be our own people. We want our culture back. Well, then hundreds, thousands of them had to die because Russia said, no, you're our citizens and we will kill you as our citizens. That's what we're going to do because we want our internal colonies to not get the message of The idea that freedom can be regained, that idea is a taboo. Instead, everybody needs to bow to the center.
There's one another thing concerning, and it's not so much Russian opposition, but the way how Russia is covered in the respectful, one of the most trustful media. And just a few days ago, I was watching this. One of them, I think it was all about sort of anniversary of invasion. And first one, I think it's BBC Victoria Derbyshire. She had an interview with the Russian ambassador in London. And it's just facepalm because um, why would you give the platform? You know you won't have the dialogue. He wouldn't hear you. He would carry on and again and again and again, pushing his propaganda, and you will try to sort of. It doesn't matter how good you are as a journalist. He was trained and qualified not to listen to you by telling his agenda. And again, why would you give the platform? Why would you give them a word? You know, because you know what they say, and it's nothing nice is coming or any productive coming. The other thing that was, again, BBC, there was a podcast, The Global Story, or something like that, and they had this sort of conversation with Steve Rosenberg, who is based in Moscow, married to Russian, kids Russians, they there, and we expecting him to talk objectively about Russians, how Russians shocked and how Russians suffering because they want to live a normal life, and from time to time this invasion of the war, this regular killings in Ukraine, sometimes disturbing it. Or the other thing, which was quite some time ago, The Economist had the complimentary. They sort of like usually they're good, and I know the guy who is based in Kiev. It's Oli, and he's good reporter. He's good journalist, and then there's one day there's article coming out. I think it wasn't his, but there's the guy who was planning his trip to Moscow. So he need to write an article how glorious John Putin and how Ukraine is struggling, and so to make sure that his trip to Moscow is safe. But this is manipulation. You know, this is manipulation and it's very harmful. It's basically crime against those people who trust you. Have you noticed or have you got any examples of your own?
Yeah, I think when you bring up the example of interviewing the ambassador, I think there is there are also two ways of thinking about it. First of all, the both sidism is an endemic problem. It's very hard for media to to one day just recognize that, it's not two sides to a conflict. There's this as black and white as things ever come. There is a absolutely, good and evil kind of dilemma. There's one invader and one country being invaded. It's not, don't look for both sides, but it's not a natural instinct because if our media, Western media, say BBC or The Economist or whoever else, weren't trained to look for both sides, we would have worse media. So we're in a sense, um, a lot of our institutions, our democratic institutions, our free press and so on, are getting weaponized by Moscow so effectively. Moscow weaponized German war guilt to say we owe something to Russia, or forget them Ukrainians, they're also Russians. It's like all kinds of things are being twisted on its head so effectively. And the difficulty for us in Europe or US is to not come down to the Russian level. We cannot fight Russian lies with more lies. We have to fight them with truth. So I can see the reason why a BBC journalist would want to speak to a Russian ambassador. So they wouldn't be, you don't give space to conspiracy theories saying, oh, because BBC took a side and therefore they don't want us to know the truth. And because there's so much poison getting spread all around all kinds of information spaces. So in a sense, BBC feels compelled to then show us the other side, and if we're not complete idiots, we will see that this person's lying through his teeth and be able to judge for ourselves. But there's there's this duality, right? On one hand, institutions and our systems or norms are getting weaponized against us, but we can't abandon them either. And so we need to find a way to push back. And I think this, to me, this is actually a really big problem that has yet to be solved. I'm not like solved is a strong word, like not even understood. That we in the West have all the power. We have, European economy is 10 times Russia's economy. If you take the free world, including US, Canada, Japan, Korea, so on, half of the world economy is free world. Russia's economy is 2%. This is us, this is them. We have all the power and they have all the initiative. So why is our media space getting poisoned by Russian money? Why are MEPs, the members of European Parliament, get to be discovered to be Russian agents? So if all of this is being done to us, uh, so I would like, let's imagine this, unit of malice. So the Russians take a unit of malice and throw it at us. And we just take it and we sit there and think, oh, we have to not be like them. It's like we need to not respond in kind. It's if they come in and poison Litvinenko with polonium in London, we don't need to go and poison somebody with polonium in Moscow. That's not right. We shouldn't be becoming, terrorists with chemical weapons or whatever. We did not need to come down to the level, but we cannot cede all the initiative. We cannot always operate in the frame that Moscow sets for the free world, saying, "Oh, here, door A or door B, doesn't matter which one you enter. We in Moscow gave you two options. You chose one or the other. You're still screwed." We should be setting up options. And until we grasp this, that we have this power, we shouldn't be ashamed of having power. We've built free societies. Our societies are stronger, more resilient. The life is better in Europe than it is in Russia. We should not be ashamed of it. We have to defend ourselves in a serious way, not by simply waiting for Russia to get better or waiting for Navalny or Yulia Navalny to ride in on the white horse into the Kremlin and build democracy. That's not going to happen. We need to recognize that initiative. We need to step up and say we will act in our own self-interest in a serious way. We struggle in the West to just give Ukraine the weapons to fight. Ukrainians are willing to fight. They don't want to be killed by Russians. They're standing up and fighting for freedom. We can't even muster the will to give them the weapons they need. But the problem is deeper. It's like we are refusing to act in our self-interest, and Russia again poisons our discourse, takes our courts, our democracy. What it's doing was all the elections all over the place, like this Romanian election. The guy was, his bribes and so on. But every time we discover any malfeasance, you can always multiply it by 100. If you found one MEP who we know was bribed by Russia, how many are there of folks in various parliaments in Europe with ties, known or unknown? All of this is happening, and we're just not acting proactively. We're not stepping up to do something ourselves, not in response, but ourselves saying we will not be pushed around.
100% agree. And the question I'm asking all my guests: why do you like Ukraine? Why do you love this country? And for the people who haven't been in Ukraine, and if they go or when they go, what would first thing would steal their heart?
It's a big and serious question. I'll give you two answers. So Ukraine is the only place in the world now where people are willing to fight and die for freedom. It's and they're willing to do it in mass. Like, the Western coverage sometimes focuses on problems with mobilization, but hundreds of thousands of people volunteered. People had their lives in Poland, their businesses, and they, on February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded en masse all over the place, they just left everything, their families, and went back, volunteered to fight for freedom, to not to to really sacrifice everything, put everything on the line for something that we here profess. In America, freedom is the biggest word there is. It's like any politician, if they want to get out of jail free card, they'll talk about freedom. But who is willing to fight and die for it are Ukrainians. And the other thing that I think is interesting and hard to for the West to fully appreciate. Ukraine is a civic nation, and when Russians want to uh, badmouth Ukraine, they'll talk about nationalism. Well, my roots are Armenian and Jewish, and by all, if people heard our conversation, they could easily paint me as a Ukrainian nationalist. But it's a civic nation. It's to feel Ukrainian, you don't have to be ethnically Ukrainian. You just have to share the values. You have to believe in this idea of voля. For your listeners, if they're not fluent in Ukrainian, voля stands for freedom and also willpower. So it's will to freedom all in one short word, and it's absolutely central. It's the essence of the entire nation. And if you travel to Ukraine, you will appreciate this. Somehow will shine through. I For my work, I remember having to travel to various places, Astana in Kazakhstan, Tbilisi, Yerevan. I went to Moscow, Kiev a bunch of times. And every time you go to Moscow, like as soon as you arrive, and you don't have to like or hate the place, like there's this terrible pressure on you, like just starting with the airport experience. Like people, the faces are down, like it's just absolutely depressing. Feel like the feel in Moscow, you cannot genuinely feel good. And you go to Kiev, you know, back when I traveled, you hear Russian language in both places, and but you have this sense of optimism, like the sunshine, or like it doesn't, the weather didn't matter. It's just the people are different, and they don't mind smiling, which is you don't expect Russian people to smile at you, because if a Russian person smiles at the other, they'll think it's a threat. I'm not exaggerating. This is actually like common knowledge. It's don't smile at strangers, because that could lead to nothing good in Russia. But yeah, I think there's whoever's visited Ukraine at least once falls in love with Ukraine. So that's all I'm gonna say.
Andrew, thank you very, very much. I hope it's only the beginning of your regular appearance on the podcast. I'm sure we will have zillion reasons to discuss and give the highlights or um, to our viewers, and eventually celebrating the victory of Ukraine and very sort of solid peace. Thank you very, very much. And yeah, and thank you for reaching me out.
Thank you, Jenny. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава! So, I hope most of you felt a little bit more Ukrainian. This spirit of freedom, and you hoping, or maybe you're dreaming, or you're planning to go to Ukraine when it's safe and peaceful. Thank you for watching, and let me know what you think about this conversation. We don't have to agree on all points, I get that. I'm happy to agree to disagree with you. And if you noticed some worrying and concerning bits which was mentioned today, like media or the Russian so-called opposition rhetorics or other things, please let me know and let's have a look. And of course, we will discuss this interview next day, Monday, after publishing. And please, please, please don't forget, like, share, subscribe, and stay with our community. It's very inspiring, and thank you, everyone. Lots of love whenever you are. Bye.